Have you ever found yourself caught between desire and duty? Between what your heart wants and what society expects? What would you do if one night on a simple staircase your entire world shifted forever? I never believed in fate until that September evening when everything changed. My name doesn't matter now, but what happened between those concrete steps and apartment 4B will haunt me for the rest of my life. This is the story of how forbidden nights with my neighbor began on the staircase, and how they nearly destroyed everything I thought I knew about love. It started innocently enough. I was 28, recently divorced, and trying to rebuild my life in a modest apartment complex downtown. The divorce had left me emotionally drained, questioning everything about relationships and trust. I kept to myself, worked long hours at the accounting firm, and came home to silence and microwave dinners. Then she moved in across the hall. Elena was her name, though I wouldn't learn it for weeks. She was married to David, a traveling businessman who was gone more often than he was home. I noticed her immediately, not just because she was beautiful, with those deep brown eyes, and the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was nervous, but because she seemed as lonely as I felt. Our first real interaction happened on a Tuesday night in October. I was coming home late from work, exhausted, and carrying groceries up the narrow staircase to the 4th floor. The building's elevator had been broken for months, and the landlord showed no signs of fixing it anytime soon. Halfway up between the 3rd and 4th floors, I heard crying echoing in the stairwell. I found Elena sitting on the steps, her knees pulled to her chest, tears streaming down her face. She looked up when she heard my footsteps, embarrassed and vulnerable. Without thinking, I set down my groceries and sat beside her on that cold concrete step. "Rough day?" I asked softly. She laughed through her tears, a sound that would later become my favorite melody in the world. "You could say that." Her voice was barely a whisper. David had called to say his business trip was extending another 2 weeks. It was the 3rd time that month, and she was beginning to suspect it wasn't just business keeping him away. We talked for over an hour on those steps that night, about loneliness, about broken promises, about how it felt to be married yet completely alone. When we finally parted ways, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, a genuine connection with another human being. As I watched her disappear into apartment 4B, I knew my quiet, predictable life was about to become very complicated. The next few weeks followed a pattern that became both thrilling and torturous. Elena and I would accidentally encounter each other on the staircase. Sometimes she was coming home from her job at the local library. Sometimes I was leaving for my evening jogs. We'd sit on those same steps and talk about everything and nothing, books she'd discovered, places we'd traveled, dreams we'd given up on. I learned that Elena had wanted to be a writer, but settled for library work when David convinced her that creativity didn't pay bills. She learned that I'd once planned to teach high school math, but ended up in corporate accounting after my ex-wife insisted on financial stability over passion. We were two people who had compromised ourselves into lives that felt like beautiful prisons. The first time she touched me was completely innocent. I was telling her about my childhood dog, and she reached over and brushed a tear from my cheek that I didn't even know had fallen. Her fingers lingered on my skin for just a moment longer than necessary, and the electricity between us was undeniable. We both pulled away immediately, the weight of her wedding ring suddenly visible between us like a neon warning sign. But desire is a powerful force, and loneliness makes people do things they never thought possible. Our conversations grew longer, more intimate. She told me about David's emotional distance, how he treated her more like a housekeeper than a wife. I shared my fears about never finding real love again, about settling for mediocrity because it felt safe. One night in November, Elena was waiting for me on the staircase when I came home from work. She'd been crying again, but this time there was something different in her eyes, determination mixed with desperation. David had missed their wedding anniversary dinner for a client meeting that she later discovered was a lie. She'd found receipts for expensive dinners for two while he was supposedly working alone in Chicago. That night, for the first time, I kissed her. Right there on step number 7, counting from the bottom, I would remember that detail forever. Her lips were soft and tasted like the peppermint tea she always drank when she was anxious. When we broke apart, she whispered, "This is wrong," but she didn't move away from me. "I know," I replied, my forehead resting against hers, "but it doesn't feel wrong." We agreed it was a mistake, a moment of weakness that wouldn't happen again. But the human heart doesn't follow logical agreements. 3 days later, we kissed again. A week after that, our conversations moved from the staircase to my apartment when David was traveling. We told ourselves we were just friends, providing comfort to each other, but we both knew we were lying. Our relationship intensified with frightening speed. Elena would text me when David left for work, and I'd make excuses to leave the office early. We'd spend hours talking, laughing, sharing dreams we'd buried years ago. She started writing again, short stories that she'd read to me while curled up on my couch. I dusted off my old math textbooks and began researching teaching certification programs. The physical intimacy began gradually. A hand held a little too long, arms around each other during emotional conversations, falling asleep together on the couch while watching old movies. We were crossing lines we'd sworn we wouldn't cross, but each boundary that felt like coming alive after years of sleepwalking through life. I knew I was falling in love with her, but I told myself it was just the excitement of something forbidden. Elena was married, and I was still legally bound by divorce proceedings that seemed to drag on forever. We were both trapped in situations that prevented us from being together openly, which made our stolen moments feel even more precious and dangerous. The first night Elena stayed over was a Tuesday in December. David had called to say he'd be in Seattle for a week, and there was something in her voice when she told me that suggested this trip was different. She brought a small overnight bag and stood in my doorway looking terrified and exhilarated. "I can't keep pretending this isn't real," she said. That night changed everything between us. We made love with the desperate passion of people who knew their time together was borrowed and limited. Afterward, as she lay in my arms, Elena told me she was going to ask David for a divorce when he returned. She couldn't live a lie anymore, not when she'd found something real with me. I should have been happy, but a cold dread settled in my stomach. "Are you sure?" I asked. "Once you do this, there's no going back." She kissed my chest and whispered, "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." For 2 weeks, we lived in a bubble of stolen happiness. Elena would spend entire nights at my apartment, leaving early in the morning before the neighbors were awake. We planned a future together. She would leave David, I would finish my divorce, and we'd start fresh somewhere new. Maybe I'd go back to teaching, maybe she'd pursue her writing seriously. For the first time in years, the future felt bright and full of possibilities. But secrets have a way of revealing themselves at the worst possible moments. David came home early from his Seattle trip on a Thursday night. Elena had been at my apartment for 2 days straight, and we'd grown careless about checking her phone. When we finally saw his missed calls and messages, panic set in immediately. Elena rushed back to her apartment to face the music, and I paced my living room like a caged animal, listening for raised voices or worse through the thin walls. Hours passed in agonizing silence. When she finally returned, her face was pale and her hands were shaking. David hadn't just suspected her affair. He'd hired a private investigator weeks earlier. He had photos of us on the staircase, entering and leaving each other's apartments, holding hands during walks in the park. He knew everything, and he was furious in the cold, calculating way that men like David expressed anger. "He's not going to divorce me," Elena said, sinking onto my couch like her legs couldn't hold her anymore. "He says if I try to leave him, He'll destroy both of us. He'll make sure I lose my job, that no library will hire me again. He has connections everywhere in this city. The walls of our perfect bubble were collapsing around us. David was a successful businessman with influence and money, while Elena and I were just ordinary people who'd fallen in love at the worst possible time. He held all the cards, and he knew it. "We'll figure this out," I promised, pulling her into my arms. "We'll leave the city if we have to. Start over somewhere he can't touch us." But Elena was already pulling away from me, and I could see the defeat in her eyes. "You don't understand," she whispered. "He knows about your divorce proceedings too. He's friends with your ex-wife's lawyer. If this affair comes out now, you'll lose everything in the settlement. Your house, your savings, your reputation at work. He'll make sure of it." The cruel irony wasn't lost on me. In trying to find happiness after one failed marriage, I'd potentially destroyed any chance of recovering from it financially or professionally. David had turned our love into a weapon against both of us. That night was the last time Elena stayed over. We held each other until sunrise, both knowing it was goodbye, even though neither of us said the words. When she left, she pressed a folded piece of paper into my hand. A story she'd written about us. About two people who found love in the most impossible circumstances. The next few weeks were hell. Elena and I barely spoke, exchanging only polite nods when we passed in the hallway. I could hear David's voice through the walls more often now, and sometimes Elena's muffled crying late at night. I wanted to burst through their door and rescue her, but I knew it would only make things worse for both of us. My divorce proceedings suddenly became much more complicated. Documents went missing, meetings were postponed, and my lawyer started asking questions about my living situation that suggested David was making good on his threats. I was forced to accept a settlement far worse than originally negotiated, leaving me with barely enough to start over. 2 months later, I found Elena waiting for me on the staircase one last time. She looked different, thinner, sadder, but with a resolve in her eyes that I recognized. She was holding an envelope and a set of keys. "David got transferred to the New York office," she said quietly. "We're moving next week." My heart shattered completely, but I tried to keep my voice steady. "Is that what you want?" She was quiet for a long moment, staring at the keys in her hand. "What I want doesn't matter anymore. This is the only way to protect both of us from him." Elena handed me the envelope. It contained every story she'd written during our time together, along with a letter I was too emotional to read until after she was gone. She kept my spare key as a reminder, she said, of the only time in her adult life when she'd felt truly free. The letter revealed truths that made our separation even more painful. Elena was pregnant. She'd discovered it the week before David came home early, but in the chaos of his threats and ultimatums, she'd never found the right moment to tell me. The child might be mine, the timing was unclear, but she'd decided to let David believe it was his. It was the only way to ensure the baby would have stability and that David would never suspect the affair had continued after his initial discovery. I read that letter a dozen times, memorizing every word. Elena was sacrificing her happiness and our future to protect our child and me from David's vindictive nature. She was choosing security over love, duty over desire, the same way we'd both done so many times before in our lives. 6 months after Elena moved away, I finally left the apartment complex. I couldn't stand walking past those stairs every day, remembering the night that changed everything. I used my teaching credentials and moved to a small town 3 hours away, where I got a job at the local high school and tried to build a new life from scratch. I think about Elena every day. I wonder if she's happy, if she ever thinks about our forbidden nights and the love we shared on that staircase. Sometimes I imagine her writing stories about us, about two people who found each other at exactly the wrong time and lost each other because the world wouldn't let them be together. The cruelest part of forbidden love isn't the secrecy or the guilt. It's the knowledge that what you felt was real and pure, even if circumstances made it impossible. Elena taught me that love can exist in the most unlikely places, even if it can't survive there. Our story began on a staircase and ended with her disappearing into a life I'll never be part of. But those stolen moments were more genuine than anything I'd experienced in my marriage or have found since. Sometimes late at night, I sit on my front porch and remember the sound of Elena's laugh echoing in that narrow stairwell. I remember the way she'd tuck her hair behind her ear when she was nervous, and how her eyes lit up when she talked about the stories she wanted to write. I remember the weight of her hand in mine and the way she whispered, "I love you," like it was both a prayer and a confession. People say that forbidden love is just infatuation, intensified by obstacles, but they're wrong. What Elena and I shared was deeper than desire and stronger than circumstance. It was two lonely souls finding each other in the darkness and creating light, even if that light couldn't last. We loved each other completely and honestly, even though we could never love each other openly. The staircase where our story began still exists in that downtown apartment complex. Sometimes I drive by just to see if the building looks the same. New tenants have moved into our old apartments, and the elevator has finally been fixed. But I know that if I climbed those stairs to the 4th floor and sat on step number 7, I could still feel the ghost of what we had. The laughter, the tears, the desperate kisses, and the dreams we shared before reality tore us apart. If you've ever experienced a love that society said was wrong, if you've ever had to choose between your heart and your responsibilities, then you understand why I'm sharing this story. Love doesn't always come at convenient times or in acceptable packages. Sometimes it arrives in the form of your neighbor on a staircase in the middle of your broken life, and it changes everything, even though it can't save anything. Elena, if you ever hear this story and recognize our truth in these words, know that I have never stopped loving you. Know that somewhere in a small town 3 hours from where we met, there's a man who still believes that what we shared was worth all the pain that followed. And know that I hope your child, our child, grows up in a world where love doesn't have to be forbidden to be real. Don't forget to subscribe to Top Life Stories for more real stories that will touch your heart and remind you that love in all its forms is the most powerful force in the human experience.